So meditation 3, a lot of it has to do with God, doesn't it? And this translation that we're using is something I recently found on the internet. It's not just a translation; it's by a very respected philosopher and scholar who is taking certain liberties with the text in order to make them more comprehensible to the contemporary reader. And from what I've seen of the translation, the work, it's very good. There are certain liberties that he takes, and he tries to indicate them. When he's really differing from Descartes' original text. But it seems to me that he's got it right, my reading of Descartes. So there's nothing in here which is exactly not Cartesian, you might say, but there are certain parts that seem to me to be something of an interpretation rather than a strict translation. And this part that I'm going to read you may be one of those parts. He says, this is on page 10, at the top of the second column, he says, when I get the opportunity, I shall examine whether there is a God, and if there is, whether he can be a deceiver. If I don't settle this, it seems, then I can never be quite certain about anything else. That's a very interesting thing to say. Again, I think it might differ from what Descartes explicitly says, but it goes with my own previous understanding of what place God actually plays in Descartes' Meditations, which is, after all, not a work of theology, right? It is a work where we sort of decided, we could see from the opening, it's a work about, whether a man actually knows what he thinks he knew, and whether he can ever find out whether he actually knows anything. And then it is also a work about what the world is like. That is, it goes on. Can I know anything? And if so, how? And if I can know something, what can I know? What sort of things about the world can I actually know with certainty? And what may I sort of think that I might know without certainty? But this notion that if I can't decide whether there is a God and whether he could be a deceiver, I can't quite be sure that I know anything else. Well, I think, as we'll see, that so-called criterion of truth, that is what I conceive, vividly, and whatever I perceive very vividly and clearly is true, that is a little bit fishy, isn't it? I mean, we can see already. I mean, it's pretty obvious. If something appears to me to be really, really true, then it must be true. If it's vividly true, and no, I mean, as we'll see, Descartes is going to have to appeal to something else, and it's not that criterion of truth is worthless, but that it may not quite do the job. And as we'll see, when he's able to prove the existence of God, which he tries to do, whether we believe his proof is a good one or not is something else entirely. But when he's able to his own satisfaction to prove that God exists and to prove that God is no deceiver, because an all-powerful being can certainly make things seem true to us which are not true. But when he's able to establish those things, that is, that God exists and that God is not a deceiver, then that adds a lot of weight to that criterion. Because after all, if there are things that I am strongly and upon reflection justified in believing to be true, if I'm strongly disposed to believe these fundamental things true because they appear to clear and distinct or vivid and clear to me, but I'm wrong, then that would really call into question whether God, what sort of God we're talking about here. That if God exists, if he's all-powerful, then it would seem that if he were also a deceiver and deceived me so fundamentally that these things that appear to me to be absolutely vivid and clear and distinct, if they turned out to be false, then that would really throw the whole rationality of the universe into question. So, part of what Descartes is trying to do is to say, can he extend this knowledge of himself as a thinking thing? Can he use it as a foundation or as a lever to as leverage for finding out other things. And what he's really concerned with here is whether his idea of God is a truthful idea. He talks a lot about sort of the inventory. He does an inventory of the ideas that he has, and he asks himself, the ultimate question, which is, whether these ideas represent anything beyond himself, right? Whether my idea of a cow comes from something out there called a cow, whether my idea of my own hand, which I have, and conceive of my hands, comes from independently existing hands. And one of the things that I think he concludes here in chapter 3 is that almost all of his ideas could have come from himself. That is, he could have created all these ideas. All these ideas could have been based upon himself, because he's established that he exists as a thinking thing. And even, he says, his ideas of physical things, which are very different from, obviously, from thinking things, that they could have originated from himself. His own idea of his own substance or being could have produced these ideas of other sorts of substances or being out there. But he says that there's one idea that he has, his idea of God, that could not have come from himself. And that's an incredibly important part of his argument, right? And if you look at that, his argument for that, he has this idea of a perfect being. He has an idea of an all-powerful and perfect being. And the question is, could that have also been created from himself? Well, his argument, as I take it, is that he recognizes that he himself is not perfect, not infinite, not perfect, not omniscient, not having all these traditional qualities that we attribute to God. So that this idea could not have been innate. It could have not come from himself. This is the one idea where he can be sure that his idea his idea is not a reflection of himself, but a reflection of something beyond himself, and had its origin and cause in something beyond himself. And look at those arguments. I don't know whether you think they're good or not, but they're certainly plausible. But you can see how important that is, not just in itself for a person of the time, and for any person of religious disposition to try to establish that God exists, but also for his argument, because he's going to need that God, right? I mean, that clear and vivid, or vivid and clear, the traditional way of translating it is clear and distinct, and read the translator's note for his reasons for using vivid and clear, I believe, rather than just clear and distinct. But that criterion of truth is not going to hold up by itself. It's going to need something else, and I've always thought that God, for Descartes, is that something else. That is, he'll recognize that I can be wrong about all sorts of things, but if I'm wrong about these fundamental things like the very existence of physical objects, for instance, the very existence of a world external to me and external to my mind, if I'm wrong about that, then that calls into question how I was made. I mean, or the motives of the all-powerful being who would deceive me to such an extent. And if we can establish that God is good, and part of that goodness is that he would not deceive creatures like us, then you can see where Descartes is going in terms of having something of an argument to support, well, what Russell said was merely an inference, right? Going back to appearance and reality. That is, that there is something beyond the sense data, or beyond the appearances, or beyond my own perceptions, that my own sense data or appearances or perceptions point to. An external world. A world that is independent of myself, composed of physical objects. Now, whether I can know them individually is another question, but at least that there is a physical world, a universe that is distinct from me, independent of my own thinking, and which to some degree it can be a source of knowledge.